A recent article in the Daily Beast poses the question, Jim Clyburn has plenty of power with Joe Biden. Is he actually using it? When asked how he wields his power, the number 3 Democrat said, quote, "I don't see myself as having any kind of role in this administration. I do things I have always done."
Democratic strategist and SVP for Firehouse Strategies, Michael Starr Hopkins, and senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, Inez Stepman, join us now to discuss. Inez, do you believe him?
No, I mean, I can't pretend to be an expert in behind-the-scenes Democratic politics, but I seriously doubt that's true. Obviously, things in Washington operate. A lot of deals are cut in restaurants, in bars, and behind the scenes instead of an open debate in front of the people. So I wouldn't take that for face value.
I mean, Michael, to what extent would the left actually want Clyburn to wield his power in the Biden administration? I mean, he just waded into the primary between Nina Turner and Chantal Brown, which I think tells us that he's probably exerting more power in the Biden administration than we would want anyway. But where the anti-establishment people would want anyway. But to what extent do you think, A, he's saying what's true, and B, that people would want him to even be influencing Biden?
Well, the Congressional Black Caucus is one of the most powerful caucuses in Congress, and Clyburn's voice is an important voice in that caucus. So I think he's being a little humble and meek, if nothing else. But, I think he has, up to this point, has kind of given Biden room and not pressured him. But I think it's time to take that approach off the table and really double down. Look, if we're going to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act pushed through, if we're going to get the George Floyd Act pushed through, we're going to need pressure put on the Biden administration. And Clyburn's going to be kind of at the essence of that. And so this desire to give Biden room was nice in the first 150, 200 days. But now it's time to get to work.
Yeah, I mean, like Michael says, Clyburn basically made Biden president.
Yep.
And has several of his closest allies working, very closely with Biden. Inez, is the point here more that Clyburn doesn't really need to exert any influence because Biden is kind of doing exactly what Clyburn would want him to do anyway?
He's already stacked the deck with people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the open question is how much does Joe Biden himself direct the Biden administration? And there are a bunch of warring factions within that administration, both ideologically and just on the personal level. And yeah, I mean, I would read from these comments that Clyburn is pretty happy with the job that Biden is doing and doesn't feel the need to publicly exert power. Or maybe he really is, as he said, he's only going golfing with the president. That's what he wants to do, and that's the kind of power that he wants to wield behind the scenes in the White House. But overall, I mean, I do think that a lot of these kinds of conversations that happen behind closed doors, I realized that people really wanted to go back to normalcy after the pandemic and the year that we had. But we have to remember that normalcy, quote unquote, brought us to the point that we were in 2015, 2016, throughout the Trump presidency. We've been at each other's throats, metaphorically, hopefully, sometimes non-metaphorically, and normalcy, quote unquote, brought us to that point. So even though it's tempting to imagine that Sleepy Joe will take us back, we won't have to think about politics anymore. We can just continue as normal and reset, let's say, to 2012, 2013. I don't think that's really possible. All the same forces are still there in American politics, and it's almost like the establishments of both parties are pretending that the last few years are a blip instead of the beginning of, I think, what are political earthquakes that are going to continue for a long time.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, David Sirota recently tweeted, "The world is on fire. Millions of Americans need help from Congress, and yet Whip Clyburn is constantly telling the media about how much golf he's playing." At the same time, he was asked, Michael, by the reporter whether or not he thinks Stephen Breyer should resign. And he also gave a blasé answer to that, too. He's like, hey, Breyer's not really any older than I am. And, hey, look how much golf I'm playing. Look how great I'm doing. Given what Democrats have watched happen to the Supreme Court over the last several years, how do you think Clyburn can get to a place where he says something like that?
Yeah, let me first say I have a lot of respect for Jim Clyburn, but that was one of the dumbest comments I have ever heard. Stephen Breyer staying on the bench is dangerous for democracy. Democrats have watched Mitch McConnell steal seats on the court. President Biden has said he won't add seats to the court. It blows my mind that Democrats keep trying to play this game of, being fair and not making things political when we are in an overtly political system. Democrats need to add seats to the court. Clyburn needs to pressure Biden to get Breyer off the court. I mean, this is just, we managed to do the dumbest things possible. And this is a perfect example of that.
I'm not going to disagree with that, but I'll throw it over to Inez just to say, what do you think explains this tactic from Clyburn? And it is very clearly a tactic. It may not be consistent in all cases, like wading in to support Chantal Brown, although there's an argument that is consistent, but the sort of public-facing neutrality, right? This idea that, as Michael said, the blasé statements on hot-button issues that should actually be pretty obvious if you're a Democrat. Breyer's retirement, it's kind of a slam dunk. So what do you think actually explains this strategy from Clyburn's perspective?
Look, I absolutely, I'll agree with one thing that Michael said. I didn't agree with a lot of it, but I do agree that the nomination and confirmation of Supreme Court justices is a political process. It goes through the political branches for a reason. It certainly makes strategic sense for Democrats to have Breyer retire and replace him with someone younger to exactly avoid the situation that possibly he retires or passes away under a Republican administration, and we all have the same fight once again. But why are they sort of interested in keeping smooth sailing? When we were talking about the Republican Party under Trump, there was a constant drumbeat of discussion about, whether the Republican Party was going to crack up, whether the various factions in the Republican Party were going to be able to hang together. And those were totally legitimate conversations to have. And I think we have to keep having them because the Republican Party is far from unified also, and has some major fault lines within it. But the same is true of the Democratic Party. And I would imagine that Jim Clyburn and others have an interest in trying to represent, and unlike the case of the Republicans, they have a press who also wants to maintain that illusion the Democratic Party doesn't have deep cracks in it. But I think that both establishments of both parties are under the delusion that they can, at least in terms of how they present themselves, they can turn the clock back to, let's say, 2013, 2014. And that's just not possible. There's a reason we got to the place that we did, and it's a fantasy. We have to address the fact that there are these deep cracks in these coalitions. They may very well break apart and realign in different ways, as has happened in American history with the political parties before.
The good old days of 2013 and 2014, where we could all at least agree on droning people relentlessly.
and we still do, apparently. Michael, Inez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.